There's a moment, a quiet one, when you realize the world no longer makes sense. Not because someone died, not because something bad happened, but because the very rules of existence betrayed you. The rules that said, if I cry, someone will hold me. If I scream, someone will hear me. If I am innocent, no one will hurt me. That's a lie. There are people walking among us who were broken in such a way that even time stepped back. Pain didn't pass, it calcified. They look normal. They smile at the cashier. They kiss their children goodnight. But deep inside, they carry something most of us don't even have the words for. A total loss of trust in being itself. Jean Améry was one of those people, a philosopher, a Jew, a survivor of Auschwitz. But don't call him a survivor, because what he survived wasn't death. It was the unbearable continuation of life. Anyone who has been tortured remains tortured. Jean Améry. He didn't write to heal. He didn't believe in healing. He wrote to make sure we understood one thing. What happened to him could happen to anyone. And once it does, there's no going back. You may think this is just about war, about torture, about a distant past. But ask yourself, when did you stop believing people would protect you? When did your body become something you didn't feel safe in? When did you start thinking the world wasn't meant for you? This is not a story about history. This is a story about the fragility of existing and how easily it collapses. This is about Jean Améry, the man who lost faith in the world, because the world first lost its humanity. And the terrifying part? He might be more lucid than any of us. You think the world is solid. You think reality has structure, that people follow basic rules. Don't touch what's not yours. Don't hurt without cause. Don't destroy what breathes. But there's no law in the human heart. There's only expectation. And expectation is a gamble. A child beaten by their parent learns this young. A woman assaulted by someone she trusted feels it in her bones. A man wrongly imprisoned learns it minute by minute. That the social contract is a myth, and once it breaks, you are prey. This is the beginning of the end of the world. Not the world outside, but the one you were living in inside your skin. Jean Améry was not broken because he was tortured. He was broken because torture shattered the hidden scaffolding that holds up our being. Trust, not in people, in reality. In his words, whoever was tortured stays tortured. The pain, the fear, the shame, they do not fade. They anchor you to a new reality, one where the world has ceased to be reliable. Amery was arrested by the Gestapo in Belgium in 1943. What happened to him in the cell that followed wasn't just physical violation. It was ontological destruction. He writes that when the first blow landed, he was not yet afraid. But when it became clear that no help would come, that no law would intervene, that the torturer was the only truth in the room, something inside him snapped. Trust in the world, that basic trust which we normally give without noticing, was gone. This isn't dramatic, it's phenomenology. Philosopher Martin Heidegger once spoke of being in the world as the foundation of existence. We are not minds floating in space. We exist in a web of meanings that feel stable until they don't. Torture, Amery argues, is not just pain. Pain can be endured. Torture is the deliberate destruction of the world of another human being. You are no longer someone who speaks. You are someone who screams. You are not heard. You are measured, silenced, calibrated. The body, once your home, becomes a hostile territory. And from that moment on, it will never feel like yours again. This isn't just theory. Ask survivors of state terror in Argentina. Ask former political prisoners in Syria. Ask the thousands who survived CIA black sites, or Guantanamo, or Brazil's military dictatorship. What they describe is almost identical. They broke me. Not my body, my world. And this breaking has a name: betrayal of the existential contract. Modern neuroscience confirms this. PTSD is not memory in the usual sense. It's the impossibility of memory being processed. The hippocampus, responsible for organizing past events, is hijacked. The amygdala, the fear center, goes into permanent red alert. The result? The event doesn't become the past. It becomes a trap. You don't remember the trauma. You relive it. And with it, the conviction that the world will never be safe again. This is the psychological echo of what Amery captured philosophically. That once reality fails you, it never fully returns. But there's more. Amery doesn't plead for healing. He rejects the idea that time restores. He calls that a comfortable illusion of the unscarred. To forgive would be to betray myself. To forget would be obscene. What he lost was not just peace. It was the ontological innocence that makes daily life possible. The ease with which we walk into a room and expect not to be harmed. The simple, unspoken belief that other people are not threats by default. That's gone. And in its place, a vigilant, exhausted, hyper-aware consciousness that never rests. Most people think trauma is a wound. Jean Améry teaches us, trauma is a new condition, a new ontology. Once the bond of trust in the world is broken, you don't get better. You carry the fracture, you live inside it. You speak, but the voice comes from a room no one else can enter. I was alone, not because no one stood beside me, but because the world had moved on without me. Trust was not broken like a glass. It was erased, like a language no longer spoken. The man who tortured Jean Améry may have gone home that night to read Goethe. He may have listened to Bach. He may have kissed his children goodnight, then returned the next morning to break someone's teeth with his fists. This is not paradox. This is the secret horror of civilization. Culture does not civilize. The books, the music, the theories, they don't make you better. They make you more efficient. They give you elegant words for brutal instincts. They teach you how to kill without stuttering. This is what Amery learned in the camps, that the highest achievements of the mind could coexist, even collaborate, with the lowest degradations of humanity. Culture was no help to me at all. On the contrary, it betrayed me. He was raised in Vienna, the heart of the intellectual West. He read Kant, Nietzsche, Proust. He believed that ideas had weight, that literature refined the soul. But in Auschwitz, he watched educated men, scientists, engineers, theologians, apply their training to extermination. The gas chambers weren't built by madmen. They were designed, calculated, optimized. Auschwitz wasn't chaos. It was management. It was bureaucracy, logistics, engineering. It was intelligence, weaponized. It was not a failure of reason. It was reason in the service of failure. This breaks a myth we all cling to, that the mind, if sharpened enough, protects us from barbarism. That books are safeguards, that knowledge immunizes. Amery rips that apart. He writes that when the Gestapo interrogated him, they spoke politely. They used clear grammar. They respected formality, until they didn't. And when they beat him, they did it with systematic clarity. Not rage, technique. This is where the intellectual finds himself not superior, but disarmed. Because intelligence does not stop cruelty. It only justifies it better. Consider Heidegger, the most brilliant philosopher of the 20th century. He joined the Nazi Party willingly. He watched students vanish from his classroom and said nothing. Or Carl Schmitt, legal theorist of the Third Reich. Or the doctors of Mengelé's lab, who recorded their experiments with surgical precision. They weren't monsters. They were educated men, fluent in Plato and Beethoven. They believed in order. They had philosophical reasons for what they did. This is what horrified Amery more than the beatings, that his world, the world of thought, had built the machinery of hell. What collapsed in Auschwitz was not just the human body. It was the belief that culture protects us from savagery. We must ask, what is the function of intellect in a world where cruelty is rational? How do we live in a society where data decides who eats, who starves, who lives, who is disposable? How do we speak of ethics when algorithms can dehumanize more efficiently than whips ever could? The answers are not comforting. Because Amery shows us that intellect, uncoupled from empathy, becomes an instrument of silence. Somewhere right now, a student of philosophy is working at a weapons manufacturer. A literature major is ghostwriting propaganda. A biologist is running facial recognition software for state surveillance. They are not evil. They are useful. This is the new horror. Not that thought is powerless, but that thought is too easily used by power. Amery never found peace in this. He continued to write, not to rebuild the old values, but to interrogate them. To question whether the cathedral of reason, the architecture of Western thought, was ever a sanctuary at all, or just a prettier prison. In Auschwitz, I did not feel the failure of civilization. I saw its triumph, in its most absolute, merciless form. We like to think of intelligence as light, but Amery's legacy is this: intelligence is a blade, and every blade can be turned. If thought has any redemption, it is not in its elegance, but in whether it chooses to protect the fragile, the broken, the silenced. And that choice is never made in theory. People talk about closure, but they never tell you what to do when time refuses to close anything. There are people whose past is louder than their present. People who don't remember pain, because pain never became memory. It stayed real, ongoing, undigested. They look at calendars, they speak in future tense, but nothing ahead of them feels real. Time has betrayed them, and once time betrays you, even hope becomes hostile. Jean Améry didn't speak of trauma as a scar. He spoke of it as a place, a location you never leave, even as the world insists you've moved on. For him, time after torture was not linear. It was not healing. It was a prison with no clocks. The past does not merely throw its shadow over the present. The past becomes the present. In At the Mind's Limits, he describes how his body still flinched at sudden noises decades after his release, how certain smells dissolved his sense of self, how memory didn't arrive as recollection. It arrived as force. What happened to Amery didn't pass. It settled inside him, like broken glass beneath the skin. This is not psychological embellishment. This is how trauma rewires the experience of time. Neuroscientists confirm what Amery articulated with philosophical clarity. The traumatized brain gets stuck in perpetual now. The hippocampus fails to sequence the event, and so the amygdala, the fear center, reactivates it constantly. You don't remember being tortured. You are being tortured, even in a safe room, even in silence, even in bed. You are being tortured now, and now, and now. Amery refused to convert his suffering into narrative. He refused the comfort of resolution. He rejected the idea that pain has a meaning, that suffering ennobles. He did not believe in the arc of redemption. He believed in the truth of interruption. That trauma is not a wound in your story, but the story itself ceasing to make sense. There was no continuity of experience, only rupture, a cut so deep it divided me from myself. There is something brutally honest in this, because the modern world demands that we recover, that we reintegrate, that we grow. But what if growth is impossible for some wounds? What if the proper response to horror is not healing, but witnessing? Amery speaks for those who do not bounce back. He speaks for the permanently displaced, not in space, but in time. You can see it in survivors of mass violence decades later. A man who fled Sarajevo still freezes at the smell of diesel and sweat. A woman who survived childhood rape still sleeps with the lights on at 54. A genocide survivor in Rwanda still dreams of blood in his mouth. These are not metaphors. These are realities without clocks. Philosophers often treat time as abstraction. Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, Augustine's paradoxes, Bergson's Durée. But Amery brings time back to the flesh. In the camps, time had nothing to do with clocks. It was hunger. It was waiting for pain. It was the stretching of seconds into eternities of dread. And when the torture ended, that stretching didn't. He speaks of time like an exile might speak of their homeland, with familiarity, grief, and the unspoken knowledge that return is impossible. I lost my place in time, and with it, my place in the world. There is no universal map of time. For the traumatized, past and future are not opposites. They are enemies. The past intrudes. The future deceives. You learn not to trust what's ahead, because the last time you did, it led you to the room with no windows. What makes Amery's voice rare is its refusal to sweeten. He doesn't reach for transcendence. He doesn't pretend survival is enough. He says, some things should not be survived. And when they are, the price is being forever out of sync with the world. People say, that was a long time ago. Amery answers, then why is it still happening inside me? Some people don't kill themselves because they're desperate. They do it because they see too clearly. There's a kind of lucidity that burns through all the lies we live on, that suffering teaches, that time heals, that life, no matter how brutal, is always worth it. Jean Améry didn't buy any of that. He didn't end his life in 1978 because he was lost. He ended it because, for him, the horror wasn't over. It had just become invisible to everyone else. To die by one's own hand is to refuse reconciliation. It is to insist that what was done cannot be undone. Amery saw suicide not as surrender, but as refusal. Refusal to forgive. Refusal to move on. Refusal to be complicit in a world that demanded silence in exchange for survival. He had survived torture. He had survived Auschwitz. But he did not survive the expectation that he act as though survival were enough. For the tortured man, the executioner always has the final word, unless the tortured man chooses otherwise. That otherwise was death, on his own terms, not as freedom, not as peace, but as the final act of protest against a reality that never redeemed itself. Most discussions of suicide start and end in psychiatry, but Amery forces us somewhere else, into ethics, ontology, integrity. He draws from Camus, but turns him on his head. Camus called suicide the only serious philosophical problem, but he answered it with rebellion, a choice to live absurdly, without justification. Amery rejects that optimism. For him, absurdity isn't noble. It's just the final betrayal of a world that already proved itself indifferent, or worse. To endure is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is just submission dressed in moral language. There's a cultural myth that suicide is weakness, that it's a collapse of reason, that it stems from imbalance, illness, confusion. But what if it isn't? What if in some cases it's the most coherent, unflinching conclusion a person can reach? What if Amery didn't die because he gave up, but because he refused to be recruited into the lie that healing had occurred? He writes that surviving the camps left him with a body he no longer trusted and a world he no longer inhabited. He felt like a ghost, not tragic, just misplaced. Time passed. People changed. Germany reinvented itself. Even the word Holocaust became cultural property. something others could debate, analyze, monetize. And Amery watched this and said, no. His suicide is not just personal, it's philosophical revenge. A rejection of all attempts to aestheticize suffering. A rejection of redemption narratives. A rejection of closure. There is a dignity in suicide that no apology can grant. It is unsettling, yes, but that's the point. We are not meant to agree with Amery. We are meant to feel the force of his clarity, to see what it means to stare unblinking at a truth most of us avoid. That some traumas are not wounds, they are verdicts, and some verdicts cannot be appealed. And yet, even in his death, Amery left something more than despair. He left us a mirror, a challenge, not to follow him, but to understand what the world becomes when survival is treated as proof that things weren't that bad. He reminds us, just because someone lives doesn't mean they've returned, and just because someone dies doesn't mean they were wrong. There's a certain kind of pain that doesn't want to heal, not because it enjoys suffering, but because healing would mean forgetting who caused it. We live in a culture obsessed with closure. Forgive, let go, start over. But what if that's not wisdom? What if that's cowardice dressed as peace? Jean Améry refused to forgive, not because he was bitter, but because he was honest. Resentment, when it is conscious and moral, is memory refusing to be erased. Forgiveness is sold as a form of freedom, but Amery saw it differently. He believed forgiveness often serves the comfort of the perpetrator, not the dignity of the victim. In Beyond Guilt and Atonement, he dismantles the myth of reconciliation. He argues that to forgive the Nazi, even decades later, would be to say, what you did can be absorbed into time. It can be included in history. It can become just another past event. Amery says no. That kind of forgetting is ethical collapse. What the executioner destroyed cannot be restored. And the only moral position left to the victim is to preserve the wound. Resentment for Amery is not a psychological failure. It is a form of truth-telling. It keeps alive the memory of injustice in a world that desperately wants to forget it. It refuses to let horror become trivia. He writes that the torturer's crime doesn't age. It doesn't get diluted by decades or ceremonies or memorial speeches. The pain is still there, so the anger must be too. Auschwitz lies outside of time, and so does the moral weight of what happened there. This stance is uncomfortable, because it demands something we're taught to reject: moral intransigence. In a world addicted to moving on, Amery stood still and insisted that we look backward, not with nostalgia, with rage. He believed that remembering is not enough if it comes without judgment. What use is memory if it's sentimental? What use is commemoration if it dulls the edge of horror? He demanded that we keep the memory sharp, that we never adjust to it, that we never let the story become clean or poetic or painless. You can see this same instinct in places where truth has been denied. In the children of Argentina's disappeared, who still march for names. In the survivors of residential schools in Canada, who reject apologies without action. In Black communities in the US, who remember lynchings not as history, but as inheritance. Resentment in these cases is not hate, it's continuity. It's the refusal to allow a rupture to be patched over with polite lies. Amery's critics said he was clinging to the past. But what if the past is still bleeding? What if refusing to forgive is the only way to keep the wound visible, so the world doesn't forget where it came from? What if resentment is not poison, but memory with teeth? The world wants us to tidy up grief, to normalize what cannot be normalized. But Amery teaches a different ethic, that there is strength in not yielding, that sometimes to carry the wound is to carry the truth. He didn't believe in peace that comes from silence. He believed in clarity that comes from refusal. I do not want to understand the executioner. I want him to remain a stranger, forever outside the circle of the human. And perhaps this is the hardest truth of all, that reconciliation is not always the higher path, that some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt, and that healing, if it demands forgetting, is just another name for erasure. There are wounds that time doesn't heal. There are truths too heavy for comfort. Jean Améry didn't offer hope. He offered honesty. And in a world that so often trades truth for convenience, that is a rare, radical act. If you've stayed until now, it means you didn't look away. And that matters. It means you understand that not all stories should be softened, that some voices, like Amery's, need to be preserved in their full, brutal clarity. Because without them, history becomes anesthesia. This channel exists to protect those voices, to question easy answers, to keep the memory sharp. If that resonates with you, if you felt something here, then consider becoming a member. You get early access to new content, behind-the-scenes thoughts, and help shape the topics we tackle next. More than that, you become part of a community that refuses to look away. And if you'd like to go one step further, the Super Thanks feature is a way to directly support this work. It helps us go deeper, research harder, and keep these videos honest and uncompromised. But even if all you do is watch, comment, share, you're already helping more than you know. Truly. A special thank you to our newest members, Susan W. and Scorned Peon. Your presence here isn't just support, it's solidarity. This isn't just a channel, it's a space for those who think deeply, feel fiercely, and aren't afraid to ask the hardest questions. And if that's you, you belong here. See you in the next one. And until then, stay awake.